A very good morning, dear colleagues. My name is Professor Emmanuel Mgqwashu. I come from South Africa. I work for the Northwest University, and I'm the director in the Center for Higher Education Professional Development. It is a privilege for me to be invited by the organizing committee to attend this conference and to give a keynote. Really appreciated. At this conference, Africa English Language Teaching, I really am coming with a contribution that I am hoping it is going to be meaningful as we have a conversation on what it means to be in Africa and teaching English language. In terms of where we are going, in terms of my presentation, my dear colleagues, my intention is to cover those 6 topics. I begin with looking at current teachers' professional identities in our context, because it will be hard to talk about English language teaching without reflecting on the context within which it occurs. And so that is why I start with that. I hope you find it really useful. And then I move on to the reason for my topic this morning. Why theorize English language teaching from a decolonial lens? We are going to discuss this together, and I'm hoping we will be able to reflect together on that particular aspect. And then theoretically, where am I drawing from? What kinds of frames am I drawing from to make the points and the arguments I will be making? So that will be the third section of my presentation. Then what language teaching is not is critical, because there's so much going around about what is English language teaching. And so what language teaching is not, for me, it will be critical to share. Of course, drawing from the theoretical lenses that I would have discussed. And then what will be the implications for English language teaching, right? We will have to talk about that. And then lastly, I will conclude with gains on adopting a decolonial lens for English language teaching. And so I'm beginning with current teachers' professional identities, because this is critical. We cannot talk about English language teaching and teachers' professional identities without considering the broader politics in which these things are happening. The context within which teachers are teaching English, their professional identities as teachers, and the spaces where both are negotiated cannot be engaged without looking at the broader political context within which this is happening in Africa, in the world, globally. And so I start there. I note, and you will agree with me, that even though democracy seems to be a way of life across the globe, but democratic political environments are often hegemonic and antagonistic. On the one hand, it's supposed to be the rule by the people and for the people and equal participation. But all of us, if we were to be given an opportunity to talk about the experience of democracy or experiences in democratic societies, you will agree with me that they are quite hegemonic. There are certain dominant ideas that cannot be challenged, that cannot be reviewed, because they are assumed to be right. And very antagonistic as a result in our context. And this is where I think this particular presentation is critical. The other thing is there is intensified partisanship, right? Particularly among teachers and among those who work for governments. And the roles that they play in society are roles that are supposed to better the life of society. But because of partisanship, in some cases, teacher unions are actually in alliance with ruling parties. And so how does one reconcile, the fact that they are in partnership with the ruling elite and they are teachers and they are supposed to contribute to social struggles? If the ruling party, the ruling elite, makes policies that are not favoring the masses that are imposing particular curricula. How does a teacher who is in a teacher union, and in other words has this political partisanship, how do they play their role of being the critical voice for the voiceless when they are already in alliance with the elite? And so that's one of the things. The other one is that literacy practices that foreground nation-state commonality and exceptionalism is rampant around democratic societies. Okay? So what really happens for educators is this imposition to ensure a narrative, a big, grand, beautiful narrative. Fancy that we are a nation state and we all are one, and we actually have the high degree of commonality, and there's something unique about us, this element of exceptionalism. And teachers are expected to reinforce those ideas in society. A very compromised position, particularly as an educator, when you disagree with some of the narrative, national narrative, but you are forced because you are in this context where you're supposed to teach English. Curriculum as well tends to ignore the societal systemic inequalities. So there are systemic inequalities in our societies where we teach English, where we are teachers as our identity. Those exist. And curriculum that gets given to us often ignores those societal systemic inequalities. How do you deal with that? Of course, in particular, when it comes to English second language teaching, there is this emphasis in the curriculum on classroom debates, okay? Letter writing, let's say writing a letter to a politician, for instance, all of which presume equitable outcomes, ignoring fundamental things that are mitigating against equal opportunity to succeed, because this curriculum is given by the state and it has to be taught. No negotiation whatsoever. The other point is that all of this leads to an environment that contributes to the scapegoating of teachers for complex societal problems far beyond the classroom. By that I mean because the curriculum reinforces inequalities beyond the classroom. When learners do not succeed, when there is high unemployment rate, everything is blamed to teaching and to teachers and to schooling. And so why then are we supposed to theorize English language teaching from a decolonial lens? Given everything that I've been saying right now, why do we need to theorize English language teaching from a decolonial lens? Well, a few points. The first point that I think we need to start with, because we are talking about formal education, right? Educators or teachers have a responsibility to help learners access formal knowledge in formal learning contexts. This is what Basil Bernstein has to say about formal education knowledge. It says that formal education knowledge can be realized through three message systems: the curriculum, the pedagogy, and evaluation. And if we were to talk about each, curriculum legitimizes what is considered to be valid knowledge. Pedagogy is around issues of what is valid way, or what are the valid ways to transmit such knowledge. These things are policy matters. And then the evaluation is around how the evaluation of what has been learned has occurred. Testing, exams, all of these things are done at national level. Curriculum is something that is a result of policy and state imposed or state presented, right? As we were talking previously in terms of our context. So what is valid content? What is valid practices to transmit such content, and what are valid assessment strategies. So for Bernstein, this is how we realize formal education knowledge. Within the Western context, though, which has really influenced much of the world when it comes to our understanding of formal education knowledge, is that in that particular context, written texts are considered to be the only legitimate centers of such knowledge. Okay? So, if it is written, it is regarded as the knowledge, and the written texts are privileged as legitimate carriers of knowledge. Oral tradition does not feature prominently in formal education within Western hegemonic contexts, neither as legitimate medium of knowledge generation nor as valid for assessment. Oral tradition simply does not feature as the carrier of knowledge, as a legitimate carrier of knowledge in Western societies. Yet, for Bernstein, curriculum, pedagogy, and evaluation are the three things that are used to realize formal education knowledge. But in Western hegemony, it is only written texts that are regarded as legitimate carriers of such knowledge. Now, what this means, that is, if oral tradition does not feature prominently in formal education, neither as legitimate medium for knowledge generation, nor as valid tool for assessment, what this means then is this, that formal education seems to ignore the existence of different kinds of people. And these people already possess different assumptions about the world, a multitude of ways of speaking, of inscribing, and of valuing. It's an exclusion of a population, a large population, a generation, really. And the other thing is that, as I continue, is that because of the prioritization of written texts and legitimizing only written texts as carriers of formal knowledge, what that does is, in essence, there is an implication there. The implication is that everything other than written texts is unsatisfactory, is invalid, and therefore treated as though they are not already carriers of knowledge in many other contexts. So there are contexts where knowledge is carried through oral tradition. But once formal education disregards oral tradition as a valid carrier of knowledge, generations automatically are excluded. And so the young ones who come from homes and communities and societies where oral tradition is privileged, when we get into formal education, what happens? We start getting new names, disadvantaged. We need help. We need remediation. So it actually manufactured inequalities in colonial contexts or in post-colonies. Why? Because it is only written texts that are legitimized as legitimate carriers of knowledge, obliterating completely other ways of understanding the world which are essentially oral. So everybody across the world who gets into formal education and they bring with themselves this rich oral tradition, knowledges, ways of understanding the world that are passed on orally. The moment they get through the schooling gates, our schools, our formal education, they are suddenly disadvantaged. And what then that means is we have what we call inequalities and we present these inequalities as fact, but in fact these inequalities are manufactured. It's just manufactured inequalities because of the hegemonic nature of democratic societies, of Western societies, and quite antagonistic. And so what happens with research in English teaching then, given all this context? What happens in English language teaching research is that it is driven by a skills development focus, just skills. And these skills are driven by a strong pull around market imperatives. So it is just skills for the market. The market dictates, we want these skills. And English language teaching research is all out to submit to what the market is looking for. Cutting out generations that could contribute to the betterment of our world had we recognized that there are other forms of knowledges that aren't necessarily in written form. The other thing is that because research is like that, what ends up happening with that research is that that research then shapes English language teaching in ways that reduce the English language teaching to ensuring a perfect fit in for the market. Just fit in for the market. English language research around skills and the focus on skills. The idea being to ensure a perfect fit in for the market. A role of chiseling out otherness. So anyone who does not speak English, anyone who does not come from contexts where written texts are the only carriers of knowledge, people who come from those are othered. In other words, are seen as outsiders, and all that needs to be done for them is to just make them fit in, just chiseling out. You know a chisel? Just chiseling out otherness so that they can fit in because they are referred as disadvantaged. I argue, therefore, that English language teaching with an epistemological charge is what we need to focus on. Why do we need to focus on that? Because knowledge has nothing to do with the medium. The medium and the choice of a medium is a choice by society. It's not natural, it's not factual, it's not unchangeable, it's not a given. Every human being has originality. They don't need particular languages, they don't need particular texts to prove the validity of their ideas, originality, creativity, and contribution to human race. And so what I argue for is English language teaching needs to focus on epistemology and have epistemology as a charge that drives English language teaching as opposed to skills. And I'm going to show what I mean by that. In other words, the question around what is language? What is involved in language teaching? Who is teaching it? Who is learning? Where are they learning it? And how are they learning this language? For me, English language teaching has to shift from a skills focus to epistemology, to knowledge, to developing timeless abilities, ability to think, ability to be critical, ability to change the world, because our children are going to be the future. And the education has to be about how do they speak into the present so that they will inherit the future they are going to be comfortable with. And so, around this point, it is my view that English language teaching has to focus on cognition and epistemological access. And what I show in this slide is what could be involved in ensuring advanced levels of cognition and epistemological access. In other words, access to knowledge, not skills, but knowledge. And I'm going to discuss this now. Generally, when we talk about cognition, when we talk about knowledge, when we talk about developing the thinking abilities of our children and within the formal education context, I see the language of learning and teaching, which predominantly appears to be English. I see the language teaching, the English language teaching as a subject needs to shift from a skills focus to issues around the nature of knowledge and what English studies is about. So if you look at what I have presented in front of us there, I have the cross there with the axis. So above the middle line, I have what I refer to as subjective or contextual issues that need to inform what we do in our classrooms theoretically. Under the line, issues that are concerning objective and presenting facts in a way that reduces or are reductionist, if you like. And there is a combination of practice and theory and practice. In other words, English language teaching beginning with theory, shifting to practice. English language teaching is occurring in a context, and that context, I'm going to unpack it now. So, what is the role of the teacher, as I suggest, in this kind of setup? I define the English language teacher or the teacher of any subject for that matter as a person who is in classroom supposed to be authoritative, right? Not somebody who is imposing their worldview and sidelining learners. Authoritative in the sense of disciplinary content expert. Part of the challenge with us and focusing just on skills is that there is a marginalization of what I call propositional knowledge. In other words, foundational competencies. In other words, traditional cognitive learning. What is a verb? What is a noun? What is an adjective? What is a complex sentence? What is a compound sentence? Propositional knowledge. In other words, the invisible principles that shape what is presented in writing. So language teaching, in my view, if it were to shift from a skills focus to epistemological charge, it will begin with fundamental propositional knowledge, the building blocks, critical building blocks that are necessary for people to develop their thinking abilities, to be able to read texts in ways that will change our world and understand themselves and how their context affects them. And before that happens, there needs to be what I refer to as propositional knowledge, or if you like, foundational competencies. Competencies that are going to enable students to make informed choices as they use language. And they can only use informed choices as they use language if the teachers of the language themselves have competence and are authoritative. They have expert knowledge in the subject. Building from that, so that is in terms of the role of the teacher. Building from that is beginning to create opportunities for learners to demonstrate, right? To demonstrate their understanding of propositional knowledge, foundational competence. But what is happening is creating a safe space where the educator's role will be that of a model, modeling target texts, but with a focus on propositional knowledge. Safe space in the sense that when assessment happens, it is not assessment for grading, but it is assessment for learning. It is not assessment of learning, but it is assessment for learning. In other words, it is such a safe space that learners understand that as they are experimenting, as they are experimenting with propositional knowledge, which are meant to develop foundational competencies, as they are experimenting with that, is a safe space, and whatever feedback comes, it is meant to enhance learning rather than to grade them. So that is the second component in terms of the slide that is in front of us. Again, just to remind us, we are talking about cognition and epistemological access to deal with these fundamental inequalities that are imposed by values that appears to be non-negotiable in our democratic societies. Then the role of facilitation, because the role of a teacher and the safe space which is via the teacher as an authority in the field and enabling learners to model their understanding, those spaces are very objective, reductionist, focusing just on propositional knowledge, knowing that both of those are focused on that. And knowing how is around how then, what is the effect of choosing this type of sentence? What purpose does a simple sentence serve? What purpose does a compound sentence serve? What purpose does a complex sentence serve? When do I choose that? So the knowing how is around the application of disciplinary knowledge that we have started with, as opposed to rushing into skills that seems to be the focus, and with the market as driving what we choose as content. The focus in this instance is propositional knowledge, moving on to practical knowledge with understanding how the deployment of grammatical structures are always informed by purpose. So we use certain types of sentences, we use certain types of pronouns, we use certain types of punctuation marks, not as a technical exercise, but as an exercise that has purpose behind it. And so the second focus on safe space is for students knowing how, application of disciplinary knowledge, so that they are learning by doing and the space is safe. Then the third one is more experiential knowledge. In other words, it's more around individual learners beginning to engage at a personal level. I refer to it as personal competence. In other words, learning by engaging personally, thinking reflectively. And one of the ways we have seen in our research that the subjective nature of that particular aspect is contextual. In other words, it's beginning to allow learners to, independent of our decision as educators on which text to use and which text to choose, allowing learners and giving them tasks that will allow them to select texts that are going to enable them to further learn by engaging personally and thinking reflectively on their choices. One of the tasks, for instance, is who am I? In one case, we gave our learners an opportunity to go home and take pictures and began to create a collage around these pictures, and were asked to deploy what we covered in the first set of lessons that were around propositional knowledge, and in the second set of lessons which was around knowing how, and ask them to apply those skills in engaging with texts that they have chosen, and texts that have a personal touch, texts that are reflecting and very close to who they are. Some of them, it was very clear they come from oral traditions. Some of them, it was very clear their cultural backgrounds were quite unique to what the curriculum was intending to impose upon them. That freedom, that independence, and the facilitation from the teacher being that of indeed not teaching, not instructing, not grading, but facilitating the conversation through asking the right questions as learners were attempting to demonstrate their understanding of the propositional knowledge, their understanding of the practical knowledge, but now using a text that they themselves have chosen. And then lastly, taking learners, this is the part now where the idea is around developing skills that will enable them to read the world where they find themselves, how the newscast is presented, how the situations in their homes are, and how to explain those in the powerful language. And so that is around reflective competence, the ability for them to receive texts that we as educators present to them, and these texts are not obviously and in a visible way reflecting on the complications of being in democratic societies, of being under the Western hegemony, of being and growing up in an unequal society. Intelligently selected readings and give them to students in a way, or to learners, in a way that will enable us to develop metacognition, thinking epistemically, contextually, and systematically, and in the process bringing together the word and the world, enabling our learners to be able to read the word and the world, or read the word in the word, ensuring that the word and the world are two sides of the same coin. That, my colleagues, as a conceptual framing is what one will consider to be decolonial, and by that I mean freeing the minds from impositions of worldviews that are not interrogated. So what I've just presented now draws from two theoretical frames or two theoretical lenses: new literacy studies and decoloniality. And in terms of new literacy studies, three concepts that have given rise to new literacy studies, and the new literacy studies being a position that literacy is not a skill that can be taught and learned, but literacy is the ability to behave in ways that are in line with the social group that learners find themselves. So literacy as not a skill, but literacy as the ability to be what is expected within a community that learners find themselves. And by community, I mean disciplines or subjects, the ability to write in geography in a way that geographers consider to be legitimate, the ability to write in accounting, as an accountant, how accountants think, how accountants generate knowledge, how accountants package that knowledge, what is valid knowledge in accounting. I'm talking about that. That those things are not skills. Those things are ways of being. And so New Literacy Studies sees literacy not as a skill that can be taught, but as something that populations can be inducted into. And so three concepts around that. The first one is semiotic domains. In other words, semiotic domains are contexts that are characterized by groups who hold distinctive social practices. There are specific social practices that distinguish this particular semiotic domain. English language teaching, it appears to me, is one of the areas where we can begin as we shift from the skills focus, right? As we shift from the skills focus to enabling learning, as we shift from the transmission of knowledge as facts that cannot be changed to transforming the minds, the ability to think beyond just the rigidity of transmission of fixed ideas that are presented as knowledge and the only knowledge. And so semiotic domains are contexts characterized by groups who hold distinctive practices. They think in a particular way, they behave in a particular way. And I believe learning a language such as English is such a powerful opportunity to access those. The other concept is affinity group, referring to individuals who are members or insiders. I spoke about the teacher as authoritative. In other words, the teacher as a person who understands and has expertise and has knowledge that is far ahead when we compare the teacher to learners. He is an aspect, she is an aspect. And so affinity group are individuals who are members and are insiders within a semiotic domain. They understand these distinctive practices and they have been vetted and they have been found to be fit to be members of this semiotic domain. And the last one is around designed grammars. In other words, a set of principles or patterns through which linguistic material and practices in the domain are combined to communicate particular messages. The language of the semiotic domains is what is critical in terms of teaching. So it's beyond skills, it's beyond the ability to construct a sentence, but it is understanding ways of being within this semiotic domain as a member of this particular domain. And in terms of decoloniality, there are many strands, but I chose Orientalism. And I'm choosing Orientalism, Edward Said's famous seminal book on Orientalism, where his broader argument is that in the West, okay, there seems to be a minimalization, okay, of rich cultural diversity. In other words, the diversity that we have across our world within the Western hegemony is minimized. And therefore, the richness that comes with this diversity is minimized. And contrary to the minimization of other cultural contexts, the West is presented as culturally superior. So the silencing of diversity, which is rich, which actually can enrich humanity, the minimizing of the degree of diversity, and this push that we are a unified people, that we are same, this imposed sameness, this fabricated sameness, in terms of Orientalism, or Orientalism as a theory, according to Edward Said, is that what it does, while simultaneously minimizing the cultural diversity, simultaneously presenting the West as culturally superior. He argues universities, schools, they serve the function to minimize cultural diversity to zero, so that there will be this grand narrative, this big narrative that we are one, that we think the same, that we read the world the same, that we experience the world the same way, problematically so. And funding for research that is orientated around minimizing diversity is funding that dictates on what to be researched, what to be disseminated, and what to be popularized. And so what Orientalism has done, or that kind of culture or tradition of minimizing rich cultural diversity, that, by the way, could enrich humanity as a whole. What the West has done is to use media. By media, I mean film, I mean movies, I mean the news houses, and the funding directed to ensuring that other parts of the world are presented in problematic, minimizing ways. You look at the movies in the 80s, you look at how Americans are presented in movies. For instance, one American, Chuck Norris, will go to Vietnam and all by himself kill everyone. The entire army is dead by just this one person. Or Rambo, for instance. So there is this there is this constant representation and a down our throats view of the superiority of the West culturally. How are Muslims presented in most movies? They are presented as terrorists. They are presented as human beings that need to be feared. How are Africans presented? Presented as criminals that you need to be really, really afraid of, with bad scars. In some movies, they often have dreadlocks, and they are criminals, and they are in drugs. All of these things are not coincidental. Advertisement. Okay, so and then the newscast, the CNNs of this world, how stories are presented, how stories change when you look at different houses. But which houses are funded the most? Which houses are flooding our homes? The news houses. It is those houses that continually reinforce the West as culturally superior. And so media and communication and the texts that eventually end in our English classrooms are texts that reinforce the superiority of the West culturally, shutting out completely innovation, creativity, amazing ideas that could enrich humanity as a whole, not just the individuals who come with those ideas. And so what you find is, in terms of receptive skills, in terms of English, here I'm talking about reading and listening. Caution about the texts that we choose for reading and listening. We cannot any longer end with, they can read. Or they can listen. You see, they are even talking about it without unpacking what are the values that are transmitted through the texts that we are choosing. Are the values that are transmitted presenting the West as culturally superior, and the context where these learners are as culturally inferior? What are the consequences of that for the future? What are the consequences of that in terms of identity and the sense of self? Writing and speaking, which are productive skills, are always a result of what we prescribe. So whatever we assess, whether in written language or in speech, it always arises from what was originally a written text. So if reading is not taught, propositional knowledge is not unpacked from the readings that we teach, whatever they write will be mimicking and representing facts and presenting those facts as knowledge. But facts and knowledge are two different things. And I'm going to show, as I move on to the next slide, what language teaching is not then, given everything that I've been saying so far. Language literacy is more than giving learners information or developing a skill. That's really the point I've been trying to make with the previous slides. That in fact, if the world that we live in, the society that we are in, is so unequal, then how can we develop language literacy skills without helping our learners understand the reasons life expectancy for certain race groups is much lower? Why can't we just give a text that is actually about that, but not focus on what is happening in the text and just focus on the skills that we want to teach? Just focus on the pronouns, just focus on the paragraphs and paragraphing, just focus on sentence construction, ignoring fundamental societal issues that they are growing under. How can we end on teaching learners how to read, pronounce, and write the word poverty, and to look it up in the dictionary and just end there? Just look up the word poverty and the child is happy. Yeah, I saw poverty, and then it ends there. What kind of education is that? As I show with my next points here, that if language teaching is to be meaningful, it also needs to enable learners understand the reasons behind their experience of hunger or affluence. I work with individuals who have been so affluent from childhood that when we are in the lecture hall and I say we may have to extend the due date for this assignment, they don't understand it. Because everyone should submit an assignment. There is no appreciation, not that it is their fault, but they have no appreciation of the level of inequality that is in our lecture halls, that is in our classrooms. Why? Because of the kind of education we have been given. We have been given facts to be able to regurgitate those facts without unpacking the values that are transmitted to us unawares in the texts that we are supposed to read uncritically. Our learners need to know that to die young or to die from hunger is neither a predetermined destiny nor a biological issue for the majority members of certain racial groups and nations. They need to know this. It's not something that can just be pushed aside. And we cannot assign those things outside language education. Because language and the world are two sides of the same coin. Where do we hope this is going to be attended to? If it is attended to in history, if it is attended to in geography, if it is attended to in other subjects, the question is always, where is it reinforced? My view, language teaching is the best space where these things can be reinforced. In an unequal society like our world, learners need to know that poverty is a crime that is endorsed through profit making and prioritization of profit making. That's the cause of hunger. Hunger cannot just be a word that learners need to identify in a short story. They need to understand what it means, why it is happening, and interrogate whether or not it should be happening. And they need to understand that it is a social production that is amoral and should be considered a crime against humanity. Why? Because we're preparing them for the world that they will be in charge of. The least we can do is to give the next generation the tools to interrogate the world within which they live. And what better place to do that than in an English language classroom or language education of any group for that matter. And so what are the implications of this for English language teaching? I argue teaching or working with our learners, consciously or not, is a process of engaging in a political act. I hear people say, oh, I'm not a politician, I don't like politics, I'm just an English teacher. No, my dear colleague. You are engaged in a political act by virtue of choosing to be a teacher, to stand in those innocent young lives who are invested in you and me. You are in a political involvement. Some of us help learners succeed at mind-numbing, fill in the blanks activities. They fill in the blanks, and I'm talking about personal experience now, where I just filled in the gaps, where I just routinely memorize things without critically asking, what do these things mean for the world I am occupying, for the world I am growing up in, for the world I will be a parent one day? If there is any place where these things need to be spoken, it is in a language classroom. Why? Because the language, or let me put it differently, the word and the world are two sides of the same coin. We use the language to navigate in our world. A language education culture that brings the world and the word together, in my view, particularly in this unequal society, is the way to go. As an English language teacher, what ways do we unawares help learners replicate a system of power and domination? In what ways, unawares, do we reinforce mindsets that have produced high levels of poverty in our societies, high levels of premature deaths in our society through our education? How many young people hear about terrible things happening in our society, but nothing happens in their consciences because of the education we have given them? An uninterrogated education. And in English language classrooms, therefore, how can we enhance criticality for learners to understand that people do not overcome their difficulties by simply changing their personal habits and attitudes, or by getting good grades, or by working hard? Some of us worked so hard and we still went to homes where there was no bread. Some of us worked so hard and arrived at home and your grandmother is dead at 45. Some of us worked so hard and still lived in spaces where you only had your meal 3 days later. You had intervals of 3 days before you had a meal because that was the only way to survive. But you passed English. You know how to construct a sentence. You worked hard. But the reality when you leave those school gates faces you of poverty, of young people losing their lives. To what extent is our identity as professionals, as teachers, viewed as a political act? When I stand in that classroom, I'm not just transmitting a skill. I am giving an ability to critique society so that when these youngsters become old, they can change these things that have affected the world for so many centuries. So, in the name of developing English language skills, we cannot deflect our learners' attention, and our own actually, from the oppressive social and economic systems that keep Africa poor. We cannot. And the slide that you're looking at right now is my attempt to show what kinds of texts we can give to our learners depending on the grade level. Because if we do not do that, we are going to continue to hand over our continent, and our kids are going to inherit a continent that is in debt. The way China, for instance, has bought land across the world, the way China has offered financial relief to most countries in Africa, practically the future generations of those countries belong to China. China can make them slaves if they want. China can do anything they want with them. Why? Because our governments are owing China. To what extent do we change that? Where do we begin in changing this trajectory in our handling of language teaching? Because language and the world, word and the world are two sides of the same coin. And so the real challenge here is, when we teach language, are we transmitting knowledge or are we enabling learning? I want to argue we are enabling learning. We are not transmitting knowledge. We are enabling ability to interrogate life while learning the language. We are not just receiving facts about the language. In other words, we are engaged with how to know, how to think, rather than what to know and what to think. When I stand in front and teach language, I am engaging beyond just learning the language, propositional knowledge. I am also engaged in enhancing my learners to learn how to know, not what to know, how to think. I'm also engaged in what I call reflexivity. In other words, making plain and visible the invisible principles and circumstances that are working, that are invisible, producing reality. So what is happening in a context where enabling learning as opposed to knowledge transmission is concerned? What is happening in that context? Well, the first thing that is happening in that context is that it begins with, why am I learning? Why am I learning this? I'm showing the brain there from cognitive science to show that that portion of the brain, that's where the question, why am I doing this, is entertained. Why am I doing this? Once there is clarity on why am I doing this, there is excitement. There is no way learners cannot look forward to learning more. Why am I learning this? The why of learning is critical as we design our lessons, as we design curricula. The why of learning, the affective nectar. The next one is the how of learning. Now that I have established why are we learning this, the next question is, how can this be learned? I've been arguing since this presentation that the why of learning is the ability to bring the word and the world and see this as two sides of the same coin. That is the purpose. And because that is the purpose, then the idea is, as you can see under purpose there, understanding the world is the purpose for my language teaching. Beyond, I want them to learn punctuation. I want them to learn types of sentences. I want them to learn adjective, subject, verb agreement. Beyond that, I want them to understand the world. That is my target. And how of learning? I want them to learn how to know, to learn how to think, not what to think and what to know. And the last one, the what of learning follows as the last thing. Once I'm clear, I want them to understand the world. I'm clear, I want them to learn how to know and not what to know. And I want them to learn how to think and not what to think. Then the content that I choose is going to be the content that is presenting the world as a text. Our world as a text, like the cartoon I've just shown now, with Africa in a shopping cart being bought. Why? Because my content is designed to present the world so that my learners can be reflexive and they can be empowered to shape the world in which they are going to be adults in future. It's not just getting a degree and getting a grade, but the thinking is not the same and the world remains the same. So, as I'm drawing to a close now, what are the gains on adopting a decolonial lens for English language teaching? What are the gains? Well, there are a few. The big one is, the gain is that we are bringing a critical perspective in what we do as language teachers, with an intention that we will enhance our pedagogic practices in ways that will enable our learners to go from grade to grade, beginning to ask the right questions about their world. But what are the gains then? It works against dominant political and social forces that do not help to empower marginalized communities. That's the first thing. That a decolonial lens in former colonies enables a pedagogic practice that pushes back against inequalities. The second one is it foregrounds advocacy in preparing the young for the future of their world and not see it as overly political. As people are listening to me, there must be a sense of this is overly political. No. Why? Because being a teacher and teaching is a political act already. You are talking to the members of an unequal society. We cannot miss an opportunity to interrogate inequalities in our societies, particularly in former colonies, where the elite continues to enjoy, where the gap between the haves and the have-nots continues to expand. It also introduces curricula that reconnect with the social world in ways that support advocacy and agency. And it resists, this is very important, on gains on adopting a decolonial lens in English language teaching. It resists discourses that treat language as nothing but information exchange and literacy practitioners as technicians. I'm not a technician. You are not a technician. You are a scholar. You are a professional who is giving tools to the next generation that will help them change their future. This particular cartoon that I'm showing right now, a very simple text, looking at it at face value, but when you begin to challenge learners, having been given the tools to unpack what is happening there, what statement is that particular cartoonist is making about politics, about governance, about leadership, about elections. It's volumes. Allowing these youngsters to begin to actively change what is happening in their society. Part of the challenge, inequalities remain, is because very few individuals are taking this up. The majority see no problem. You know why? It's because of missed opportunities in our language classrooms. As I conclude, these are the thoughts I'm leaving you with. Genuine literacy development or genuine English language teaching will encourage our learners to actively change society for the better. And this is our goal. That's why we took these jobs. That's why we chose teaching. They will be encouraged to critically question why the media portrays a specific social group as undignified, irresponsible, criminals, and murderers. Our kids won't just be entertained and say, just watch a movie. They are going to learn to question that. Who decides to present this image? Who benefits from this image? They will challenge teaching strategies that contribute to own self-surveillance and self-marginalization. They will challenge those, right? Because the way we teach actually causes self-surveillance and self-marginalization because of not opening the spaces that are necessary to move our society forward. They will escape complex ways in which knowledge acquires and manages them. So there's a difference between acquiring knowledge and managing knowledge and being acquired by knowledge and being managed by knowledge. Colonial education is such that curriculum actually acquires you and manages you. And the decolonial lens into teaching and learning and teaching a language in particular will actually reverse that. And lastly, my presentation has implications, colleagues, for the ways in which we come to know a language in language teacher education and the influence of this knowledge on language teacher identity formation. Huge. As language teachers and as we teach future teachers of language, we need to ask ourselves, what identities are we forming? When we teach in front of those youngsters, what identities are we forming? These are critical questions. I'm hoping that this particular presentation was designed to attend to, and I'm hoping that what I have shared has given us enough food for thought, and I'm happy to engage in any shape or form as I finish this presentation. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Thank you, colleagues, for listening to me.